The men on the porch of the general store fell silent as the wagon approached, not from respect, but from a shared, curdling astonishment. Elspeth stood on her own porch, hands clasped loosely at her waist, watching them come. It was not one wagon, but three, a dusty, defeated caravan inching up the lane they had so often used for scornful glances. At the head was Jed Miller, a man whose face was a permanent thundercloud, his shoulders slumped now in a way that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Behind him was Silas Croft, and even the Dower Pearsons, their wagon beds ominously empty. They were the heart of the chorus that had named her Folly, the men who had laughed the loudest. They were not laughing now. She did not move. She let the silence stretch as they drew up before her gate, the dust settling on their worn boots and worried faces. It was Jed who finally swallowed his pride, a lump that seemed to catch in his throat. He wouldn't look at her, staring instead at a spot on her clean-swept porch. "Ms. Elspeth," he began. The name a strange, formal weight in his mouth. We heard you had a good harvest." It was not a question. The whole county knew. They had known for a month, whispering it like a scandal. Her barn was full. Theirs were not. Theirs were full of ruin, of droppings, and the stench of decay. "I did," she said. Her voice was even, calm. The voice of a woman who had done the arithmetic and knew the answer. Jed's eyes finally flickered up to meet hers, full of a desperate, resentful hope. They say your grain is clean." Elspeth thought of the 41 guardians of that grain, a silent, velvet-pawed army. She thought of the mockery. Cat-crazy Elspeth, the spinster with her furry children. "Yes," she said. It is the word hung in the air, a simple fact that was also a verdict. A lifetime of judgment reversed in one hot, dry season. Jed's calloused hand tightened on his wagon's side. "We'd like to buy some, one person alone," they had said. A woman alone could not run a place. And now here they were, a delegation of the entire town's failure, asking to be saved by the very thing they had despised. 2 years earlier, no one had come to meet her. Elspeth arrived with a single trunk, a deed clutched in her hand, and a silence in her heart that had settled in after the fever took her husband. The farm was her inheritance, or what was left of it. 20 acres of marginal land and a house that sagged with a weary sigh. The first thing she noticed was not the peeling paint or the broken fence, but the eyes. Dozens of them, blinking from the shadows of the barn, from beneath the porch, from the high branches of the oak tree. The place had not gone to seed, it had gone to cats. The town of Prospect had already passed its judgment. She learned it her first day, walking to the general store for flour and salt. The men on the porch stopped their whittling. "That's her," one muttered. The one took the old Miller place, another spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Place is overrun. You'd do better to sleep in the street than in that barn. Full of cats and bad luck." Elspeth simply nodded, her face betraying nothing, and went inside. The storekeeper, Mr. Gable, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, leaned on the counter. "A woman alone," he'd said, his tone a mixture of pity and predatory appraisal. "A hard go of it. That land's poor, and the barn, well. I'd be willing to take the deed off your hands for a fair price. Save you the trouble." She looked at his soft hands, then at the ledger he kept. "I'll be needing a 50-pound sack of oats, please," she'd said. And 24 traps. The traps were a lie, a small piece of misdirection to satisfy their expectations. She had no intention of trapping them. That first evening, as the sun bled out across the prairie, she sat on the porch steps and did the arithmetic. Not the arithmetic of dollars and cents that Mr. Gable understood, but the deeper, quieter arithmetic of survival. The farm had a well, tired but deep. It had a barn, structurally sound despite the swayback roof. It had 20 acres of land that had lain fallow for 2 seasons. And it had cats. She counted them as they emerged, cautiously, into the twilight. A big, battle-scarred orange tom. A sleek black queen with emerald eyes. A trio of calico sisters. On and on they came, a silent, flowing river of fur. She stopped counting at 30. They were thin, wary, but they were alive. They had survived here. That meant there was something for them to eat. And Elspeth knew what cats ate when they weren't being fed from a saucer. They ate mice. They ate voles. They ate rats. She went to bed that night not in the house, but in the hayloft, the scent of old hay and cats all around her, their soft purring a low thrumming engine in the dark. It was the first time in months she hadn't felt entirely alone. The next morning, she smashed the 24 rat traps with the back of an axe. The sharp crack of splintering was a declaration of intent. She was keeping the cats. All of them. Old Man Hemlock found her a week later, not in the fields, but in the barn, on her hands and knees, sketching in the dirt. He was her only neighbor to the west, a man from some forgotten fold of the old world who farmed his own small plot with a quiet intensity the town found peculiar. He leaned on the barn door, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, and watched her. She was drawing a map of the barn and the surrounding yard, marking with small stones where she'd seen the different cats hunt. The big orange one. He holds the door, she murmured to herself. The Black Queen prefers the high beams. Hemlock cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves skittering. The town says you are mad. Elspeth looked up, unsurprised. She had felt his presence. The town says a lot of things. They say you are feeding an army of vermin. They are not vermin, she said simply. They are guardians. She went back to her map. Hemlock stepped inside, the scent of soil and pipe tobacco following him. He peered at her strange cartography. He saw the logic in it. He was a man who understood systems, the quiet economies of the natural world that other men, in their rush for profit, overlooked. A thing is only vermin if it has no use, he said, his voice a low rumble. And a farmer's job is to find the use. He pointed a gnarled finger at the sacks of seed oats she had stacked in the corner. A cat will not eat oats, but a rat will, and a cat will eat a rat. It is a simple equation. It was the most anyone had said to her in a week that wasn't laced with pity or scorn. She felt a small, tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. He stayed for an hour, not talking much, but watching her work. He saw how she'd begun to clear the barn floor, not sweeping it clean, but creating clear pathways, alleys for hunting. He saw the shallow pans of water she'd set out. He saw the way the cats watched her, not with fear, but with a cautious curiosity. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door and turned back to her. In my country, he said, tapping his temple, we have a saying. A foolish farmer counts his seeds in the spring. A wise farmer counts his roots in the fall. He paused. You are not counting seeds, girl. You are tending roots. Do not let them tell you otherwise. It was a blessing, a validation. That night, Elspeth began a new ledger. Not for money, but for life. On the first page, she wrote, barn population, 41. She had done a final, definitive count. 41 mouths to feed. 41 sets of paws. 41 guardians. She began to give them names. The work was methodical. It was labor that no one saw, and so, in the town's estimation, it did not exist. They saw her fields, plowed and planted late, and shook their heads. They saw her mending the fence and called it a waste of time. They did not see the quiet work she did before dawn and after dusk. She named them all, the 41. There was General Sherman, the big orange Tom who patrolled the main barn door with the gravity of a palace guard. There was Cleopatra, the sleek Black Queen who reigned from the highest rafter. The three Calico sisters were Faith, Hope, and Charity. A fluffy gray cat with a perpetually surprised expression was named Mr. Wiggles. A one-eyed hunter, fierce and silent, she called Odin. She learned their territories, their alliances, their favorite napping spots. She learned the specific chirp she needed to make to summon the little tuxedo cat, Finch, and the low rumble that would bring the massive Maine Coon, whom she called the Duke, to her side for a scratch behind the ears. This was not sentiment. It was husbandry. She treated her flock of cats with the same practical attention a shepherd gives his sheep. She supplemented their diet. A portion of her oat money went to the butcher for scraps and liver. She learned to fish the creek that bordered her property, bringing back small, silvery sunfish which she cooked into a mash. The town saw her buying fish scraps and laughed. Can't even feed herself. Now she's feeding the strays. Jed Miller had bellowed at the store. Elspeth heard the story from the storekeeper's wife, who told it with a sort of horrified glee. Elspeth just nodded and bought an extra pound of liver. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was not yet ready to make it. The cats, in return for this strange new partnership, began their work in earnest. The barn, which had smelled of mouse droppings and decay, slowly began to change. The air cleared. The rustling in the walls ceased. The grain sacks, which on other farms were a constant battleground against tiny teeth, remained pristine. Her barn did not smell of mice. It smelled of hay and dust and the clean, dry scent of 41 healthy, well-fed predators. By June, the corn was knee-high, and Elspeth's days were long, filled with the familiar ache of hoeing and weeding. The cats were her constant companions. A rotating guard of them would follow her to the fields, not for affection, but for the hunt, pouncing on the field mice and voles her work disturbed. She was a moving feast for them. A boy started appearing at the edge of her property. Finn. He was small for his 10 years, with eyes that saw too much and a habit of getting underfoot in the town. He never came close, just watched from the fence line, a silent observer of her strange feline kingdom. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the fields and cracking the earth. The corn tasseled, heavy and golden. It was a good year for corn, if you could keep the pests away. Elspeth's harvest was the talk of the town, but not in the way she'd hoped. They saw the abundance and felt the sour pinch of envy. Beginner's luck, Jed Miller declared. The land was fallow. Next year it'll fail her. But it was the grain harvest that would be the real test. Her small fields of wheat and oats ripened to a perfect, shimmering gold. She worked alone, with scythe and sweat, cutting and binding, stacking the sheaves in the field to dry. The boy, Finn, grew bolder. He began by leaving a small, perfect turtle shell on her porch rail. The next day, it was a hawk's feather. Elspeth acknowledged the gifts by leaving a biscuit in their place. One afternoon, as she was hauling a heavy basket of wheat heads to the barn for threshing, she saw him by the fence, watching. "It's heavy work," she called out, not breaking her stride. "It is," he said, his voice small. She set the basket down and wiped her brow. "Do you like cats?" He nodded, his eyes wide. "They say you have 41. I do. Can I see them?" Elspeth considered him. She saw not a nuisance, but a kindred spirit. A fellow outsider. "You can. If you're not afraid of work," his face lit up. That was how Finn became her first and only farmhand. He was not strong, but he was quick and observant. He learned the names of all 41 cats. He learned who liked their chin scratched and who preferred to be left alone. He was the one who noticed that Cleopatra was expecting kittens, a fact that filled him with a solemn importance. His true genius, however, was with the grain. While Elspeth threshed, he would sit with a sieve, painstakingly cleaning the kernels, his small fingers picking out bits of chaff. It was during this process that the first proof of her strange experiment became undeniable. Day after day, basket after basket, the grain they cleaned was perfect. There were no rat droppings, no half-eaten kernels, no telltale signs of infestation. It was pristine. "It's because of them, isn't it?" Finn whispered one afternoon, nodding toward the barn where the cats lay draped over beams and barrels in the sleepy heat. "It's because there's nothing for the rats to eat. The cats get them before they even get in the door." Elspeth paused, leaning on her flail. "That's the arithmetic, Finn." She decided not to take her grain to Mr. Gable. The man's condescension had curdled into a watchful suspicion. Instead, she loaded 3 sacks of the finest wheat onto her small wagon, told Finn to watch the farm, and drove the 12 miles to the next town, the one with a proper bakery run by a man from the city. The baker, a fussy German named Schmidt, took a handful of her grain and let it run through his fingers. He sniffed it. He chewed a single kernel, his eyes closed. Then he opened them and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "God in Himmel," he breathed. "It's clean. Perfectly clean." "How?" Elspeth smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Good fences," she said. He paid her a 10% premium over the going rate and gave her a contract for all she could produce the following year. She drove home with a pocket full of coin and a heart full of a feeling she had almost forgotten: hope. She kept the contract secret, like a coal banked low under ash, waiting for the right moment to glow. The boy, Finn, became a fixture on the farm, as much a part of its ecosystem as the cats he adored. He had a way with them, a quiet patience that earned their trust. He devised a system for the daily feeding, a series of calls and whistles that brought the scattered army of 41 to the barn for their portion of fish mash and scraps. It became a spectacle. At 5 o'clock every evening, Finn would stand on the porch and begin his strange symphony. A high-pitched trill for the Calico sisters, a low chuffing sound for the Duke, a rapid-fire clicking for the younger hunters. And from every corner of the farm they would come, a flowing, multicolored tide of fur converging on the barn. The sight was so astonishing that passing wagons would sometimes stop on the road to stare. This only fed the town's narrative. "Look at that," Silas Croft was heard to say, spending her last dime to call cats to dinner. "It's a circus," but for Elspeth and Finn, it was order. It was management. It allowed them to do a daily head count, to check for injuries, to ensure the entire flock was healthy. Finn created a chart, tacked to the barn wall, with all 41 names and columns for notes. General Sherman, limp in left forepaw. Cleopatra, nursing 5 kittens in the high loft. Mr. Wiggles, cornered a garter snake. It was a document of comic dignity and serious purpose. While the town laughed, Elspeth's farm achieved a perfect, humming balance. The cats, well-fed and managed, were ruthlessly efficient. They had eradicated the resident vermin population and now formed a formidable living wall against any new incursions. The fields, free from the crop-destroying voles that plagued other farms, yielded abundantly. Her chickens, housed in a coop patrolled by a detachment of younger, quicker cats, suffered no losses to weasels or rats. She was not just farming acres anymore. She was farming a system, an ecosystem of her own creation. Old Man Hemlock would visit once a week, bringing a small loaf of his wife's dense rye bread. He never offered advice unless asked, but he would watch, nodding his approval. He'd watch Finn conduct his feline orchestra, and a rare smile would touch his lips. "They see a madwoman and a stray boy," he told Elspeth one afternoon, gesturing vaguely toward the town. "I see a general and his lieutenant. You have built a fortress, girl. But a fortress is only valued when there is a war." Elspeth looked out at her peaceful fields, at the cats sleeping in patches of sun. "I'm not looking for a war, Mr. Hemlock." He drew on his pipe, his eyes on the horizon. "War does not always ask to be looked for. Sometimes, it just arrives." The words hung in the quiet air, a premonition she did not yet understand. That autumn, she sold her entire harvest, save for her own needs and seed for the next year, to the baker in the city, again for a premium. Mr. Gable, the grain merchant, noticed. His inquiries about her yield had become sharper, his false warmth replaced by a cold, calculating curiosity. He could not understand how she was succeeding where others struggled. It was easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it, and he was convinced her luck was about to turn. The foreshadowing began not with a bang, but with a mildness. The winter that followed was the gentlest in memory. The ground barely froze. The snows were light and sporadic, melting within a day. Old-timers, who usually complained about the cold, instead looked at the too-clear sky with unease. A mild winter does not kill the pests. It lets them breed. The creek on Elspeth's land, usually a torrent in March, was a placid stream. The spring rains came, but they were warm and soft, turning the fields into a fecund, teeming nursery. Everything grew. The grass, the weeds, and the things that hid in them. The first whispers started in April. Jed Miller lost a whole sack of seed corn to rats in his own barn. "Never seen the like," he grumbled at the store. Brazen as you please, by May, the whispers had become a murmur. Silas Croft found his leather harnesses chewed to pieces. The Pearson family woke to find rats had gotten into their larder, spoiling a week's worth of food. The problem was everywhere, a gnawing, scratching, invisible tide rising around them. The rats, emboldened by a winter that hadn't thinned their numbers and a spring that offered endless bounty, were multiplying at a terrifying rate. Their numbers exploded. They moved from the fields into the barns, from the barns into the houses. The town of Prospect was under siege. Elspeth's farm remained an island of tranquility. Her barn was a fortress, its 41 guardians more alert than ever. The explosion of the rat population in the surrounding countryside meant their hunting was rewarded as never before. They grew sleek and formidable. Finn reported seeing them return from the fields with rats nearly the size of kittens. They were a silent, deadly bulwark against the rising tide. Mr. Gable, the grain merchant, was hit the hardest. His large warehouse, the central repository for the region's wealth, became a smorgasbord. He hired men to set traps, to lay poison. But for every 10 rats they killed, 100 more seemed to take their place. The poison tainted the grain it was meant to protect. The traps were a joke. The sheer scale of the infestation was a nightmare. His smooth confidence began to fray. He saw Elspeth in town one day, her wagon loaded with supplies, not grain. She looked calm, prosperous. It was an affront. "Heard the rats are bad this year," she said to him, her voice neutral. Gable forced a smile, the skin around his eyes tight. "A nuisance. We have it under control." He looked at her clear eyes, her steady hands. "Of course, a small operation like yours wouldn't have the same challenges. A person alone could never handle a real infestation." He was trying to assert his superiority even as his own world was being devoured from within. "It's all about management," Elspeth replied, and the simple statement, coming from her, was so infuriating he could barely speak. He watched her drive away, a cold knot of envy and suspicion tightening in his gut. How did she know? How was she immune? He began to watch her, to ask questions. He learned about her contract with the city baker. He learned about the premium prices. And his envy began to curdle into a dangerous, greedy resolve. The crisis peaked in late July. The first of the wheat harvests were coming in, and the news was catastrophic. Farmers brought their grain to Gable's warehouse only to find it a scene of frantic, failing battle. The stench of rot and rat poison hung heavy in the air. Sacks of grain, when opened, were found to be moving masses of filth. The arithmetic was brutal. Jed Miller estimated he had lost half his crop in the barn. The Pearsons, nearly all of it. Hunger, a distant specter on the plains, was suddenly a real and present threat. Men who had been proud landowners were now facing a winter with empty larders and massive debts. Panic began to set in. It was in this atmosphere of fear and desperation that Mr. Gable made his move. He rode out to Elspeth's farm one hot afternoon. He found her and Finn repairing a fence, with a half-dozen cats lounging in the shade nearby, watching them work. The air was clean. The only sounds were the hammering, the buzz of insects, and the distant coo of a dove. There was no rustling in the grass, no scent of decay. The place was an oasis of order in a world of chaos, and Gable hated it. "Elspeth," he said, his voice oozing a false warmth that no longer fit him. "Just checking on my neighbors." Elspeth drove a nail in with 2 clean strokes and straightened up. "Mr. Gable, terrible business with the rats," he said, shaking his head. "Just terrible. I'm losing a fortune. Everyone is." He let his eyes sweep over her neat fields, her solid barn. "I've been worried about you. A woman alone. It must be a struggle." "We manage," Elspeth said. Finn stood beside her, his hand protectively on the head of Odin, the one-eyed cat. Gable ignored the boy. "Look," he said, dropping the pretense of a social call. "I know you have a full barn from last year. I know you have a new crop coming in. And I know this place is as vulnerable as any other." He was lying, and he knew she knew it. "Before the rats find you, before you lose everything, I want to make you an offer. I'll buy it all. Your entire stock. Every last kernel. I'll give you a fair price, cash, right now. It's a risk for me, but I'm willing to take it to help you out." It was a predator's offer, dressed in the clothing of charity. He wanted to get his hands on the only clean grain in the county, to corner the market and sell it back to the starving town at an exorbitant profit. He was counting on her being a frightened, foolish woman. He had miscalculated. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Gable," Elspeth said, her voice as cool and calm as well water. "But my grain is not for sale." "Not to you." Gable's face darkened. The mask slipped. "Don't be a fool, woman. You're sitting on a treasure and you don't have the means to protect it. I'm offering you a way out." "How do you know the count of my barn?" she asked, her question so quiet and sharp it cut right through his bluster. He froze. In his greed, he had overplayed his hand. He had revealed he'd been spying, assessing her worth for his own gain. Everyone knows you had a good year," he stammered. "It was not a secret," Elspeth said. "But the amount was. My grain is spoken for, Mr. Gable. The baker in the city won't help you when your barn is crawling with rats," he snarled, his voice rising. And then Finn, the small, quiet boy, spoke up. "We don't have any rats," he said, his voice clear as a bell. Gable stared at him, then at Elspeth, then at the placid, watchful cats. A flicker of understanding, of disbelief, crossed his face. He looked at the pristine barn, the clean yard. It wasn't luck. It was intentional. He had been outmaneuvered by a woman, a boy, and a pack of stray cats. His face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed, and spurred his horse away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury behind him. The town's desperation found its way up Elspeth's lane 2 days after Gable's visit. It was not one man, but a delegation. Jed Miller, Silas Croft, the Pearson brothers. The men who had mocked her, pitted her, and dismissed her. They came not with anger, but with the heavy, shuffling gait of the defeated. They stood before her porch, a tableau of ruin. This was the moment Old Man Hemlock had foreseen. The fortress was about to be tested. When Jed Miller made his halting request to buy her clean grain, the world seemed to hold its breath. This was her vindication. She could have named any price. She could have charged them double, triple what the grain was worth. She could have bled them dry, taking their land, their tools, their dignity in exchange for the food they needed to survive. It was the logic of Mr. Gable. It was the logic of a world that had shown her no kindness. Finn stood beside her, his small hand gripping her dress. He watched the faces of the men, saw their shame and their fear, and he looked up at Elspeth, his expression full of trust. From the shadows of the porch, General Sherman watched the proceedings, his tail giving a slow, deliberate twitch. Elspeth looked at Jed Miller's worn-out boots. She looked at the worry etched into Silas Croft's face. These were not monsters. They were proud, frightened men who had been wrong, and whose wrongness had cost them dearly. Hunger changes a town. It erases old grudges and creates new, terrible ones. She saw 2 paths. One was the path of vengeance, of profit, of proving them right about her being hard and cold. The other was something else entirely. "I have grain," she said, her voice carrying in the still air. "Enough for my own needs, for my contract with the baker, and some besides." A collective sigh of relief went through the small crowd. "But it seems you need more than just some." Just then, a second wagon rattled up the lane, faster, more aggressively. It was Mr. Gable. He leaped down before his horse had even stopped. "Don't listen to her," he shouted, his face flushed. "She's a hoarder. She's been conspiring with the city baker to drive up the price and bleed you all dry. I told you she was no good. She's trying to ruin us." The men looked from Gable's wild-eyed fury to Elspeth's unshakable calm. They had known Gable their whole lives. They knew his greed. And they had watched Elspeth for 2 years. They had laughed at her, yes, but they had also seen her work. They had seen her quiet dignity. Finn stepped forward. "That's not true," he piped up. "Mr. Gable came here himself. He tried to buy all of Ms. Elspeth's grain for cheap, so he could sell it back to you. I heard him." All eyes turned to Gable. The accusation, coming from the mouth of a child, had the simple, devastating force of truth. Gable's face went from red to white. He had been exposed, his own greed laid bare in front of the whole community. He sputtered, speechless. Elspeth held up a hand for silence. "Here is the price," she said, and every man leaned in. "I will calculate what the grain cost me to grow. The seed, the wear on my tools, a small amount for my labor. I will add 1/10 to that price. That is what you will pay. Not a penny more." It was not a generous price. It was a fair one. It was a price that did not seek to profit from their misery, but simply to sustain the system that had saved them. It was an act of community in the face of ruin. Jed Miller, the man who had laughed the loudest, looked at her, his eyes shining with a startling wetness. He took off his hat. "Thank you, Ms. Elspeth," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you." The other men murmured their agreement, their assent a quiet rumble that sealed Gable's shame and cemented Elspeth's victory. The distribution of the grain was a solemn, orderly affair. Elspeth and Finn worked from dawn till dusk for a week, measuring and sacking the clean, golden kernels. The men from the town, Jed Miller included, formed a quiet, efficient line, loading the wagons of their neighbors. There was no haggling, no complaining. There was only a profound, exhausted gratitude. Cleopatra's 5 kittens, born in the high loft during the crisis, were a source of endless delight for Finn. They tumbled and played, tiny, fierce hunters in training, a promise of continuity. General Sherman lay at Elspeth's feet, a warm, heavy weight. From the barn, they could hear the soft rustle of the new kittens. A wagon passed on the road, and the driver, a man who had once jeered at her, raised a hand in a slow, respectful greeting. Elspeth raised a hand in return. She was no longer Elspeth alone. She was the woman who had listened to the land when no one else would, who had seen value in what others threw away. She had built her fortress, and when the war came, she had not used it for vengeance, but for salvation. Old Man Hemlock took the pipe from his mouth and looked out at the fields, now resting under a blanket of stubble. "A foolish farmer counts his seeds in the spring," he said, the words of familiar comfort. He looked at Elspeth, his old eyes crinkling at the corners. "A wise farmer counts his roots in the fall." Elspeth looked at the boy beside her, at the town in the distance, at the 41, no, 46 guardians settled around her home. Her roots were deep. They were strong. And they were finally, undeniably, visible for all to see.